Sometimes love finds us in the darkest moments, when we least expect it and have the most to lose. There's something powerful about a person willing to sacrifice everything for family honor, even when the world has already written them off. Rurik was a Viking trader who always collected his debts. When he came to the small coastal village looking for payment, he found a dying fisherman with nothing left but shame. The man's daughter, Elska, made him an offer no one saw coming, herself, in place of the silver they didn't have. What started as a simple business transaction became something neither of them planned for. Two stubborn people, each carrying their own wounds, about to discover that sometimes the greatest debts are the ones we owe to our own hearts. But what happens when pride meets desperation, and neither side is willing to surrender? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, wrapping around the small fishing village of Kvernum, as if the gods themselves were trying to hide its poverty from the world. Elska pulled her woolen cloak tighter against the salt-tinged wind and stepped carefully across the wet stones that led to her father's hut. Each step sent a small splash through the puddles left by the retreating tide, and she could taste the brine in the air, a flavor that had seasoned every meal and every breath of her 25 years. Inside the low-roofed dwelling, Magnus lay propped against a pile of seal furs, his once powerful frame now little more than bones wrapped in weathered skin. The man who had hauled nets heavy with herring and cod now struggled to lift a wooden cup to his lips. Elska had watched this slow decline for months, each day bringing new evidence that the sea had finally claimed its due from her father, not through storm or wave, but through the grinding weight of years spent fighting its moods. "The nets need mending again," she said softly, settling beside him on a low stool carved from driftwood. In her hands, she held his fishing net, the same one he had inherited from his own father, its hemp fibers darkened by salt water and careful patches marking decades of use. The net told the story of their family, honest work, careful stewardship, and the endless cycle of casting out hope and drawing in just enough to survive another day. Magnus turned his head toward her, his eyes still holding the pale blue of Arctic ice, despite the fever that had been burning through him for weeks. "Child, there are things we must speak of, things I should have told you long ago." She continued her work, needle moving through the fibers with practiced precision. "Father, you need to rest. The nets can wait until you're stronger." "No." His voice carried an edge of the authority that had once commanded respect in the village council. "I will not meet the All-Father with lies on my lips and debts on my soul." The needle stilled in her hands. She had noticed the changes in recent months, the way her father would stare out at the fjord with something deeper than his usual longing for the sea. The way he would count and recount their meager stores of silver, his fingers trembling as he handled each small coin. The way he sometimes muttered names in his sleep, names she didn't recognize. "What debts, father?" Magnus closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he had fallen asleep again. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, when the storms kept us harbor-bound for nearly a month and the fish runs failed. "Do you remember?" She remembered. That had been the winter of empty bellies and cold hearths, when even the wealthiest families in Kvernum had tightened their belts. Her father had grown increasingly desperate as their food stores dwindled, and no boats could safely leave the harbor. "I borrowed silver from a trader, a man named Rurik, who winters in the southern settlements. He was willing to lend when no one else would, but his terms were harsh." "How harsh?" The question came out sharper than she intended. 50 pieces of silver to be repaid within 3 seasons. If not... Magnus stopped, his breathing labored. Elska set down the net, her hands suddenly cold despite the warmth of the peat fire. 50 silver pieces was more money than most fishing families saw in 5 years. Even in good times, with full nets and fair prices, they might hope to accumulate perhaps 10 silver pieces in a year after buying food, tools, and trading for necessities they couldn't make themselves. "How much have you repaid?" 20 pieces over the years. But the interest, each season the debt grows. He calculates it in the southern way, compound upon compound. By his reckoning, we now owe nearly 100 pieces. The number hit her like a physical blow. 100 silver pieces was impossible, unthinkable. It was the kind of wealth that bought ships, not the amount owed by a simple fisherman. She understood now why her father had been growing thinner, even when they had food, why he sometimes stared at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. There must be some mistake. No interest could grow so quickly. I should have read the contract more carefully. But I was desperate, and he seemed honorable enough. His handwriting was clear, his manner direct. I thought I understood the terms. Magnus reached beneath his sleeping furs and withdrew a piece of parchment, yellowed and soft from handling. The debt scroll bore the marks of both men, her father's simple X and an elaborate signature in a firm, educated hand. At the top, a raven seal was pressed into dark wax, and below it, columns of numbers that tracked the growing debt through seasons of impossible mathematics. Elska studied the document, though she could read only simple words. The numbers, however, told their own story. Her father's initial mark beside 50, then smaller notations showing his payments, and then a series of calculations that seemed to multiply the remaining debt by mysterious formulas. When is payment due? The autumn equinox, 3 days hence, and if we cannot pay? Magnus turned his face toward the wall. The contract allows him to claim payment in other forms. Our boat, our nets, our home, and if that proves insufficient. He could not finish. Elska had heard stories of families destroyed by debt collectors, of children sold into bondage, of men who simply disappeared rather than face their obligations. In the harsh world of the northern settlements, debt was a living thing that could devour entire bloodlines. She looked around their simple home, the fishing boat her grandfather had built, the nets that represented 3 generations of knowledge, the small plot of land where they grew barley and turnips. Everything they owned together wouldn't approach half the claimed debt. There must be something we can do. Perhaps if we spoke to the village elders, they could mediate. Or we could appeal to Jarl Eriksson. What would they say to a man who borrowed silver and cannot repay it? I made this bargain with my eyes open, Elska. A man's word is his bond, and my word binds our family, she wanted to argue. To rage against the unfairness of a system that could trap honest people in webs of impossible obligation. But she had been raised in the harsh pragmatism of the northern fjords, where survival depended on accepting reality and adapting to circumstances beyond one's control. How many days' sail is it to the southern settlements? 2 days with fair wind. But Elska, you cannot think to... I think to do what must be done. She folded the debt scroll carefully and tucked it into her belt. I'll hear what this Rurik has to say about reasonable terms. Magnus struggled to sit up straighter. You will not go alone to parley with a man like that. His reputation reaches even here. They say he has never failed to collect what he's owed, and his methods are not always gentle. Then what would you have me do? Wait here while our family name dies with you in dishonor? The words came out harsher than she intended, but they carried the weight of truth. In their culture, a man's debts became his family's shame, passed down through generations like a curse. Even if they lost everything they owned, the unpaid balance would follow any children she might have, marking them as the offspring of oath-breakers. Magnus reached out and took her hand, his fingers thin, but still possessing surprising strength. You have your mother's courage and your grandfather's stubbornness. If anyone could find a way through this trouble, it would be you. But promise me you'll not trade away more than we can afford to lose. She squeezed his hand, thinking of the mother she barely remembered, a woman who had died, bringing life into a world that seemed determined to crush hope. I promise I'll do what's necessary to preserve our honor. As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion arose from the village center. Voices carried on the wind, some excited, others wary. Elska moved to the single window and peered through the oiled leather that served as glass. A ship was approaching the harbor, not one of the familiar local vessels, but a sleek longship with a proud dragon figurehead and sail dyed the deep red of expensive wool. He comes to us, Magnus said quietly. Rurik arrives 3 days early. Elska watched the ship navigate the treacherous rocks that guarded their harbour with the skill of a crew that knew dangerous waters. Even from a distance, she could see this was no ordinary trading vessel. The ship moved with the purpose of a predator, and she understood that her options had just narrowed considerably. Father, rest now. When he comes, let me speak for our family. Elska, you taught me to mend nets because broken things can be made whole again. You taught me to read the sky because storms pass and fair weather returns. And you taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by their wealth, but by how they face their troubles. She stood and smoothed her simple woolen dress, checking that her mother's iron brooch was properly pinned at her shoulder. Trust me to remember those lessons. Through the window, she could see villagers gathering at the waterfront, their postures tense with curiosity and apprehension. Children were being hurried indoors, and she noticed that several of the men had quietly armed themselves with fishing knives and boat axes. Everyone in Cavernum knew that debt collectors rarely came alone or unarmed. The ship dropped anchor just beyond the breaking waves, and a smaller boat was launched. 4 men rowed, while a 5th sat in the stern, his bearing suggesting command, even at this distance. As they approached the rocky beach, Elska could make out more details. The rowers were well fed and well armed. Their leader wore clothes that spoke of wealth without ostentation. He looks like a man who keeps his word, she murmured, though whether that would prove fortunate or disastrous remained to be seen. Magnus had managed to prop himself up enough to see through the window. Aye, that he does, which makes him more dangerous than a man who lies easily. The boat ground against the stones of the beach, and the 5 men stepped onto the shore with the easy confidence of people accustomed to unwelcome arrivals. The leader, who could only be Rurik, was younger than Elska had expected, perhaps 35 years, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from sun and salt air rather than soft living. His hair was the color of wheat at harvest, braided with silver rings that caught the light, and his eyes surveyed the village with the calculating gaze of a man who measured everything in terms of value. I should go to him, Elska said. Wait, let him come to us. A debt collector who arrives early is either very confident or very concerned. Either way, we'll learn more by making him declare his purpose publicly. She watched as Rurik spoke briefly with the village headman, then gestured toward their hut. The conversation was too distant to hear, but the headman's gestures were apologetic, almost embarrassed. When he pointed in their direction, Rurik nodded once and began walking up the path, his men falling into formation behind him. Elska took a deep breath and checked her appearance one final time. Her dress was clean but patched, her hair braided simply but neatly. She wore no jewelry except her mother's brooch, a piece of honest iron worked by a village smith rather than precious metals that might suggest hidden wealth. The footsteps on the stone path grew closer, accompanied by the soft clink of mail and weapons. These were not desperate raiders, but professional men who understood the value of appearing both prosperous and dangerous. A shadow fell across their doorway, and then came the knock, 3 deliberate raps that somehow managed to sound both courteous and inevitable. Magnus. Eriksson, called a voice that carried the accent of the southern settlements, but none of the harshness she had expected. I am Rurik Thorson. We have business to discuss. His clothes spoke of wealth but not excess, a well-made woolen tunic dyed deep blue, leather boots that had seen use but remained supple, and a cloak fastened with a silver brooch wrought in the shape of interlaced serpents. At his side hung a sword whose hilt bore the kind of metalwork that took master craftsmen months to complete. Most telling of all was the thick silver arm ring encircling his left wrist, not mere decoration, but a statement of status that could buy and sell fishing villages like Cavernum. I am Elska, the daughter of Magnus, she said, stepping aside to allow him entry. My father is unwell, but he will receive you. Rurik studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. My business is with Magnus Eriksson, regarding a debt contracted 3 summers past. Are you authorized to speak for your family in matters of obligation? I am his daughter and the keeper of this household. I will hear what you have to say. Behind Rurik, his men waited with the patient stillness of hunting wolves. They made no move to enter, but their presence filled the doorway like a promise of consequences. Elska noticed that each man bore weapons and mail of quality equal to their leaders. This was no ragtag band of desperate outlaws, but a professional crew that understood the value of reputation. The interior of the hut felt smaller with Rurik's presence filling it. He had to duck slightly to avoid the low beams, and his broad shoulders seemed to press against the walls that had comfortably housed 3 generations of her family. Yet he moved with careful respect, removing his cloak and hanging it on the peg beside the door, as if he were an invited guest rather than an unwelcome creditor. Magnus struggled to sit straighter against his pile of furs, summoning what remained of his dignity. Rurik Thorson, you come earlier than our contract specified. The autumn storms have been fierce this year. I preferred to conclude our business before the seas become impassable. Rurik settled onto a stool that creaked under his weight, his movements economical and controlled. You received my message regarding the final payment. I received no message. Rurik's eyes narrowed slightly, and Elska caught him touching his silver arm ring, a gesture so brief she might have imagined it. Then I will be direct. According to our agreement, the full balance of your debt falls due at the autumn equinox. That day is tomorrow. Tomorrow? Magnus's voice cracked. But the contract said 3 days hence. The contract specifies the equinox itself, not 3 days after. Perhaps you miscounted. Rurik withdrew a leather portfolio from his belt and removed the duplicate of their debt scroll. His copy was pristine where theirs was worn, the ink still dark and clear. The balance currently stands at 97 pieces of silver, plus accrued interest for the final quarter season. Elska felt the blood drain from her face. Even their inflated figure had been optimistic. How much interest? She asked. 3 pieces of silver. The total debt is exactly 100 silver pieces, payable in full by sunset tomorrow. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Magnus closed his eyes, and Elska could see him calculating desperately, trying to find some combination of their possessions that might approach even a quarter of what they owed. Our boat might bring 15 pieces if we could find a buyer, Magnus said quietly. The nets and tools perhaps another 5. This land and dwelling would yield perhaps 10 pieces, and only if someone were fool enough to buy a fisherman's plot this close to winter. Rurik's assessment was delivered without cruelty, but its accuracy was devastating. Your total assets might satisfy 30 pieces of the debt. What of the remaining 70? Silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the poorly fitted door and the distant sound of waves against stone. Elska watched her father's face crumble as the mathematical reality crushed his last hopes. There must be some accommodation we can reach, she said. Surely a man of your standing has no need to destroy a simple fishing family for a debt that began as 50 pieces of silver. Rurik turned his attention to her, and she felt the weight of his evaluation like a physical touch. You speak of accommodation. What do you propose? Extended terms. My father could continue making payments. Your father is dying. The statement was delivered matter-of-factly, without malice, but with absolute certainty. Even if he lived, his earning capacity is finished. A fishing boat requires strength he no longer possesses. Magnus flinched as if struck, but he did not contradict the assessment. They all knew the truth of it. Then the debt transfers to me, Elska said. I can work. I can fish or find other employment, and how long would it take you to earn 70 pieces of silver? Rurik leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent. A skilled craftsman might accumulate such wealth in 15 years of careful saving. A woman working as a servant or field hand might manage it in 30, assuming she never needed food or shelter for herself. The hopelessness of it struck her like a physical blow, but she refused to surrender to despair. There must be something of value we haven't considered. Some arrangement that preserves my family's honor while providing you with fair compensation. Honor. Rurik repeated the word thoughtfully, rolling it around his tongue as if tasting an unfamiliar flavor. An interesting concept from a family that borrowed silver and cannot repay it. My father borrowed in desperation, not fraud. He intended to honor his obligations. Intention is not payment. I have my own obligations to consider. Investors who provided the capital I lend, crews who depend on successful ventures, a reputation that ensures future compliance with my contracts. Rurik gestured toward the doorway where his men waited. Those men have families too. Should they suffer because your father miscalculated his ability to repay a debt? The logic was unassailable, but Elska refused to accept defeat. Then take what we have. Take everything, but let my father die with his name intact. Everything you possess wouldn't cover half the debt. The contract specifies remedies for insufficient payment. For the first time, real fear crept into Magnus's voice. What remedies? Rurik withdrew a second document from his portfolio, a single sheet of parchment covered in dense script. Bonded service to cover the unpaid balance. Standard terms in cases of default. Slavery, Magnus whispered. Indenture, Rurik corrected. 7 years of service for every 20 pieces of unpaid debt. In your case, that would be 25 years. Elska's voice was steady despite the terror flooding through her. 25 years would be her entire remaining youth, her chance for marriage and children, her hope of any life beyond servitude. The contract allows for assignment of indenture to family members in cases where the debtor is incapacitated. Rurik's eyes remained fixed on her face. You could choose to accept responsibility for your father's obligations. Magnus struggled to sit up straighter. Never. I will not allow my daughter to pay for my mistakes. Father, I said never. The outburst triggered a coughing fit that left flecks of blood on his lips. When he could speak again, his voice was weak but determined. Take what you will from our possessions. If that proves insufficient, then I'll come with you myself. Rurik regarded the dying man with something that might have been respect. You would not survive the journey to my holdings, and dead servants provide no labor. Then we are at an impasse, Magnus said. I will not sacrifice my daughter, and you cannot collect from a dead man. Elska listened to this exchange with growing frustration. Two stubborn men, each locked into positions that served no one's interests. Her father was determined to protect her at the cost of his honor, while Rurik seemed equally committed to collecting his due regardless of the human cost. There must be another solution, she said. Some middle ground that satisfies both honor and obligation. Rurik stood and moved to the window, gazing out at his ship anchored in the harbor. Honor is a luxury for those who can afford it. Obligation is a chain that binds us all. He turned back to face them, and Elska caught a glimpse of something unexpected in his expression. Not cruelty, but a kind of weary resignation. I take no pleasure in destroying families, but I cannot allow sentiment to undermine my business. What if there were a way to satisfy the debt without destroying our family? Elska asked quietly. I'm listening. She took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. You speak of indenture, of service to cover unpaid debt. The contract allows assignment to family members. Elska, no. Magnus tried to rise from his bed. 25 years is indeed impossible, she continued, ignoring her father's protests. But what if the terms were different? What if the service were more valuable than mere labor? Rurik's expression sharpened with interest. Explain. You are a wealthy man, but you travel alone. You have crews and business associates, but no family that I can see. A man in your position would benefit from someone capable of managing household affairs, understanding local customs, providing counsel in unfamiliar territories. You propose to serve as what? A housekeeper? I propose to serve as a partner in your enterprises. Someone who can read situations and people, who understands both hardship and survival, who can be trusted with important decisions. Elska straightened to her full height, meeting his gaze directly. In return, the debt would be considered satisfied immediately. My father's honor remains intact, and you gain something far more valuable than 25 years of grudging labor." Magnus was shaking his head frantically, but Rurik held up a hand for silence. "You would willingly accept indenture under modified terms. I would accept partnership under terms that preserve my family's honor and provide you with genuine value. And when I no longer require your services, then I would be free to go with appropriate compensation for faithful service." Rurik walked slowly around the small room, his footsteps deliberate on the packed earth floor. Elska could see him calculating, weighing the offer against alternatives that all seemed to lead to unsatisfactory outcomes. "You understand that such an arrangement would require you to leave everything familiar? My business takes me throughout the Northern Territories and beyond. You would see your home perhaps once or twice in a decade. I understand. You would be completely dependent on my protection and provision. If you proved unsuitable or troublesome, you could be abandoned in foreign territory with no resources and no recourse." "I understand that as well." Rurik stopped pacing and faced her directly. "Why would you make such an offer? Any rational person would see the dangers. Because my father is dying, and I will not let him die dishonored. Because our family name means more to me than my personal comfort. And because I believe I can be more valuable to you as a willing partner than as a resentful servant." For a long moment, silence filled the hut. Magnus had stopped protesting, recognizing that his daughter had committed herself to a course he could not change. Rurik stood motionless, his hand unconsciously touching his silver arm ring as he weighed a decision that would reshape multiple lives. "The terms would need to be explicit," he said finally. "Duties, expectations, compensation, conditions for termination of service. I agree. You would swear the oath publicly, before witnesses, so there could be no question of coercion." "I agree to that as well," Rurik nodded slowly. "Then we have the foundation of an arrangement. I will draft the terms tonight and present them tomorrow morning. If you still choose to proceed after a night's reflection, we will formalize the agreement." Magnus finally found his voice. "And if she chooses not to proceed, then we return to the original contract terms, and I collect what I can from your assets." Rurik's tone carried no threat, only inevitability. The choice will be hers alone. As he prepared to leave, Rurik paused at the door. "You should know that I have never taken an indentured servant, modified terms or otherwise. This arrangement will be as unfamiliar to me as it will be to you. Then we will both need to learn as we go," Elska replied. After he left, Magnus turned to his daughter with tears in his eyes. "Child, what have you done?" "What you taught me to do, father. I've mended something that was broken." But even as she spoke the words, Elska wondered whether she had truly found a solution, or simply traded one form of captivity for another. The night passed like a vigil, with Elska sitting beside her father's bed, while he drifted in and out of fevered sleep. Each time he woke, Magnus would look at her with eyes full of regret and pride, warring against each other. She had laid out her few possessions on the wooden table: a spare dress, her mother's iron brooch, a small eating knife, and a comb carved from walrus ivory that had been her grandmother's. Everything that defined her life could fit in a single leather satchel. "You still have time to change your mind," Magnus whispered as dawn light began filtering through the oiled leather window. "Rurik seems an honorable man, but honor among traders and honor among family are different things entirely." Elska fingered her mother's brooch. Running her thumb over the simple iron worked into the shape of intertwined ravens. It was the only piece of jewelry her family had ever owned, made by the village smith as a wedding gift when her parents were young and hopeful. The metal was plain, unadorned by silver or gold, but it represented something more precious than wealth: the love between two people who had built a life together despite having very little. "Tell me about her again," she said softly. "About Mother." Magnus's eyes grew distant. Astrid was the daughter of a sheep farmer from the inland valleys. She came to the coast for the midsummer festival when she was 18, and I was foolish enough to think I could win her with my skill at the boat races. A weak smile touched his lips. I came in last, but she said she admired a man who would finish what he started even when he had no hope of winning. How did you convince her to stay? I didn't. She convinced herself. Said the fjords called to something in her blood, that she could hear the sea singing even when she was miles inland. Magnus coughed, a wet sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. She was never afraid of hard choices, your mother. When the midwife said, bearing you might kill her, Astrid said that dying while bringing life into the world was the best death a woman could ask for. Elska closed her eyes, trying to picture the woman who had given her life at the cost of her own. Do you think she would approve of what I'm doing? I think she would be proud of your courage and worried about your safety, just as I am. Magnus reached out and covered her hand with his. But she would also understand that sometimes we must risk everything to preserve what matters most. As the sun climbed higher, sounds from the village began to filter into their hut. Dogs barking, children calling to each other, the scrape of boats being dragged across shingle. Normal sounds of a normal day, as if the world hadn't shifted beneath Elska's feet the evening before. A shadow fell across their doorway, followed by the same deliberate knock they had heard yesterday. This time Rurik entered alone, carrying a rolled parchment sealed with the same raven mark that had bound her father to his impossible debt. I have prepared the terms of our agreement, he said without preamble. Would you hear them now, or do you require more time to consider? I will hear them. Rurik unrolled the parchment, and Elska was struck by the neat precision of his handwriting. Each letter was formed with the careful attention of someone who understood that words on paper could reshape lives and fortunes. The service contract between Rurik, Thorson and Elska Magnusdottir, he began. First term, the debt of Magnus Eriksson, totaling 100 pieces of silver, shall be considered satisfied in full upon execution of this agreement. Second term, Elska Magnusdottir shall serve as household manager and business advisor for a period of 7 years, providing counsel on local customs, managing domestic arrangements, and assisting in trade negotiations as required. 7 years. The number was far better than the 25 years of standard indenture, but it still represented a significant portion of her remaining youth. By the time her service ended, she would be past 30, old for marriage by most standards. Her childbearing years half spent. Third term, Rurik continued, wages of 2 silver pieces per year, paid into trust until the conclusion of service. Fourth term, appropriate clothing, food, and shelter to be provided according to her station. Fifth term, the right to terminate service early for cause, with appropriate compensation for time served. What constitutes cause? She asked. Dishonesty, theft, deliberate disobedience, or conduct that brings dishonor to my name or endangers my business. Rurik looked up from the parchment. The same standards I would hold for any trusted associate, and if you choose to terminate the arrangement, then you receive full compensation plus an additional payment equal to 1 year's wages, and safe passage to any reasonable destination of your choosing. Elska studied his face, trying to read the man behind the careful legal language. These terms seem surprisingly generous for an indenture contract. They reflect the value I place on willing service versus coerced labor. Rurik rolled up the parchment. A resentful servant is worse than useless. They can actively damage your interests while appearing to serve them. I prefer arrangements where both parties benefit. Magnus struggled to prop himself up. What assurance does my daughter have that you will honor these terms? What recourse does she have if you prove false? The contract will be witnessed by the village headman and sealed in the presence of your neighbors. Copies will be filed with the trading guild in 3 separate ports. Rurik's tone carried no offense at the question. My reputation depends on honoring my agreements. A man who breaks faith with indenture contracts will find it difficult to secure future loans or partnerships. There is one condition I would add. Elska said quietly, speak it. I want to be present when my father dies. If we are within reasonable traveling distance, I want to return for his funeral. Rurik considered this for a moment. Reasonable distance would be defined as no more than 5 days hard sailing. If we are farther away when word reaches us, you would have to accept that duty prevented your return. I accept those terms. Then we have an agreement." Rurik stood and moved toward the door. "I will have the documents prepared for signing within the hour. After that we sail with the afternoon tide. So soon. Winter approaches, and there are contracts I must fulfill before the seas become impassable. The longer we delay, the more dangerous our travels become." After he left, Elska began gathering her few possessions. The simple act of folding her spare dress and wrapping her comb in a piece of cloth felt like preparing for her own funeral. Everything familiar was about to disappear from her life, replaced by uncertainties she could barely imagine. "I wish I could give you something more valuable to remember us by," Magnus said, watching her pack. "Some piece of family treasure or inheritance worthy of your sacrifice." Elska picked up her mother's iron brooch, weighing it in her palm. Such a simple thing, unadorned metal worked by village craftsmanship rather than the elaborate silverwork favored by the wealthy. But it connected her to generations of women who had faced impossible choices and found ways to endure. "This is worth more than gold to me," she said, pinning the brooch to her traveling dress. "It carries the love of people who understood that real wealth cannot be counted in silver." By midday, word of the unusual arrangement had spread throughout the village. Neighbors began arriving to witness the signing, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity, sympathy, and relief that someone else's family bore this burden. Elska recognized the looks, the same expressions people wore when watching a house burn, grateful for the entertainment while thankful it wasn't their own home in flames. The village headman, Erik Olafsson, arrived carrying his staff of office and a face heavy with the weight of unwelcome responsibility. "This is highly irregular," he announced. "Indenture contracts usually involve criminals or debtors caught in deliberate fraud." "The circumstances are unusual," Rurik agreed, "but the legal framework is sound. The contract has been prepared according to standard guild practices." Erik examined the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that his signature would be scrutinized by others. "The terms appear fair, more generous than typically seen in such arrangements." He looked at Elska. "Child, do you enter this agreement of your own free will, without coercion or undue influence?" "I do. And you understand that you are binding yourself to 7 years of service, during which time your movements and actions will be constrained by the terms of this contract." "I understand." Erik nodded reluctantly and affixed his mark to the document. As the formal witness, his signature carried the weight of village approval, making the arrangement legally binding under both local custom and guild law. One by one, the villagers stepped forward to add their marks as secondary witnesses. Some offered quiet words of encouragement, others simply performed their duty in silence. When the last signature was complete, Rurik carefully sealed the document with wax and his raven signet. "It is done," he announced. "Elska Magnusdottir is now bound to my service under the terms specified." The words seemed to echo in the small hut, carrying the finality of a funeral pronouncement. Elska felt something inside her chest tighten. Not quite grief, but a profound sense of endings. The woman who had awakened in this hut that morning no longer existed. In her place stood someone new, someone whose life belonged to a stranger and whose future lay beyond the horizon. Magnus pulled her down beside his bed for their final moments together. "Promise me you will not lose yourself in service to this man," he whispered. "Promise me you will remember who you are and where you come from." "I promise, Father, and promise me you will look for chances to build your own happiness, even within the constraints of your contract. 7 years is not forever, and the woman you become through this experience may be stronger than the one you are today." Before she could respond, Magnus's breathing became labored, and she realized that their conversation had exhausted what little strength remained to him. His eyes were already growing distant, focusing on something beyond the confines of their small room. "Go well, my daughter," he managed to say. "Live fully, love deeply, and remember that your mother and I will be watching over you." Elska kissed his forehead, tasting the salt of tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Rest now, Father. Your honor is safe." As she stood to leave, Magnus seemed to rally one final time. "Rurik Thorson," he called out. The trader paused in the doorway. "Yes, that woman carries the best of 3 generations in her blood. Treat her with the respect due to someone who has sacrificed everything for family honor." "I will remember that," Rurik replied solemnly, and then they were walking down the path to the harbor. Elska's single satchel slung over her shoulder and her mother's brooch catching the afternoon sunlight. Behind them, the hut that had sheltered her family for 3 generations grew smaller with each step, until it became just another structure among many, indistinguishable from any other poor fisherman's dwelling. At the water's edge, Rurik's crew waited with professional patience. They helped her into the small boat without comment or curiosity, treating her presence as simply another aspect of their leader's business. As they rowed toward the waiting longship, Elska turned for one last look at the village that had been her entire world. The hut where her father lay dying was visible as a thin line of smoke rising from its peat fire. Soon that smoke would stop, and the building would stand empty until the village council decided its fate. Her family's presence in Kvernum would fade like footprints in sand, leaving no trace except in the memories of neighbors who would gradually forget the details of their struggles. Having second thoughts, Rurik asked quietly. Elska touched her mother's brooch and felt its familiar weight against her chest. "No, this is the path I chose, and I will walk it with dignity." As they reached the longship and Hans helped her aboard, she realized that her old life was already becoming a story she told herself rather than a reality she lived. The future remained unwritten, full of dangers and possibilities she could not yet imagine. The ship's sail unfurled with a sound like thunder, and the dragon-prowed vessel began its turn toward the open sea. The first sensation that overwhelmed Elska aboard the longship was the sheer scale of organized activity. Where her father's fishing boat had required 2 men at most, Rurik's vessel hummed with the coordinated efforts of 20 crew members, each performing specialized tasks with the fluid precision of long practice. The ship itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, 60 feet of oak and iron that cut through the waves with the grace of a living creature. Near the stern, mounted in a brass housing that gleamed like gold in the afternoon sun, sat the ship's most precious navigation tool, a lodestone compass carefully carved and balanced to point toward true north regardless of weather or visibility. Elska had heard of such devices but never seen one, and she found herself drawn to its quiet authority. Here was an object that could guide travelers through unknown waters, a constant reference point in a world of shifting currents and changeable winds. Fascinating, isn't it? Rurik appeared beside her, following her gaze to the compass stone. "My grandfather acquired it from a Byzantine trader who claimed it was blessed by monks in Constantinople. Whether that's true or not, it has never failed us. How does it work? No one knows for certain. Some say the stone remembers the direction of its birth in the earth. Others believe it responds to invisible currents that flow around the world like rivers in the sky." Rurik touched the brass housing with obvious reverence. "I prefer to think of it as proof that even in the midst of chaos, some things remain constant." Elska understood the metaphor, but said nothing. Constancy was a luxury she could no longer afford. Everything that had once seemed permanent in her life, home, family, future, had been revealed as temporary. Only this journey into uncertainty remained real. The crew worked around them with polite efficiency, adjusting rigging and checking supplies, while pointedly not staring at their unexpected passenger. Elska could feel their curiosity like heat from a fire, but their discipline held. These were professional sailors who understood that their leader's business was not their concern. "They're wondering what to make of you," Rurik observed quietly. "It's not often I take passengers, especially women traveling alone." "What have you told them?" "That you are bound to my service under legal contract, and that anyone who shows you disrespect will answer to me personally." His tone carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Beyond that, they know better than to ask questions." As the ship cleared the harbor and entered the open fjord, the motion changed from gentle bobbing to the longer, more complex rhythm of deep-water sailing. Elska had spent her entire life around boats, but never on a vessel large enough to ride the swells, rather than simply endure them. The sensation was both exhilarating and unsettling, like being carried by a giant animal whose strength dwarfed human concerns. "You'll want to find your sea legs quickly," said a voice behind her. She turned to see a grizzled sailor with arms thick as ship's timbers and a grey beard braided with small shells. "First day or two can be rough for landlubbers." "I've been on boats before," Elska replied. The sailor grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "Fishing skiffs don't count, lass. This beauty moves different than anything you're used to." "I'm Thorvald, ship's mate and keeper of the crew's stomachs." Elska: "Aye, we heard. Word is you're working off some family debt." Thorvald's expression grew more serious. "Can't say I understand the arrangement, but Rurik's a fair man. Do right by him, and he'll do right by you." Over the next several hours, other crew members approached with similar introductions. She met Bjorn the navigator, whose weathered hands could read wind patterns like written words. Olaf the carpenter, who spoke to the ship's timbers as if they were living things. Eric Ironhand, the weapons master whose collection of scars told stories of battles in distant lands. Each man treated her with cautious respect, neither dismissive nor overly familiar. They seemed to understand that her position aboard their ship was unique, not quite crew, not quite passenger, but something unprecedented that required new protocols of interaction. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the initial excitement of departure gave way to a more sobering reality. The coastline that had defined her entire world was now little more than a dark line against the sky. With each hour that passed, that line grew fainter, until she could no longer distinguish individual landmarks or even be certain which bay had sheltered her village. The motion of the ship, combined with emotional exhaustion, began to take its toll. Her stomach lurched with increasing frequency, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. She gripped the rail, fighting waves of nausea that seemed to coincide with the vessel's rhythm. "It will pass," Rurik said, appearing with a wooden cup filled with clear liquid. "Ginger tea with a small amount of ale. Thorvald swears by it for new sailors." Elska accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the sharp scent of the ginger. The first sip burned slightly, but warmth spread through her chest and seemed to settle her rebellious stomach. "How long before it gets easier?" "For most people, 2 or 3 days. Some never fully adapt, while others take to deep water sailing like they were born to it." Rurik leaned against the rail beside her, his gaze following the flight of seabirds that wheeled around their wake. "My first voyage lasted 2 weeks, and I spent the first 4 days certain I was dying. But you continued sailing." "I had little choice. My father believed that real education came from experience, not instruction. He sent me to sea at 14, with orders not to return until I had learned to read wind and weather like a book." Elska studied his profile, noting the small scars that marked his hands and face, evidence of years spent in dangerous places doing dangerous work. "Did you ever regret leaving home so young?" "At first, but I came to understand that comfort is the enemy of growth. The easy path makes us soft, while hardship teaches us what we're truly capable of enduring." As evening approached, the crew began preparing for night sailing. Lanterns were lit and secured, watches were assigned, and sleeping arrangements were organized with the methodical precision of long practice. Elska watched this routine with fascination, recognizing that she was witnessing a complex social organism adapted to survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. "Where will I sleep?" she asked. "I've had a small shelter erected near the stern. Privacy and protection from weather, but close enough to the crew that you'll be safe." Rurik gestured toward a canvas-walled enclosure that hadn't been there when they'd departed. "It's not luxurious, but it should serve until we reach our first port." The shelter proved to be a masterpiece of practical design, just large enough for a sleeping pallet and her few possessions, with rope grommets that allowed the walls to be secured against wind while maintaining ventilation. A small oil lamp provided light, and thick wool blankets offered warmth against the growing chill of evening. As she arranged her belongings in the tiny space, Elska felt the strange dislocation of trying to create familiarity in a completely foreign environment. Her spare dress hung from a peg that Olaf had thoughtfully installed. Her comb and eating knife found places in a small wooden box that someone had provided. Her mother's brooch she kept pinned to her traveling dress, its weight a constant reminder of the love that had shaped her and the values she carried into this new life. Outside her shelter, she could hear the crew settling into their evening routines. Quiet conversations, the scrape of metal on stone as weapons were maintained, the soft sounds of men preparing for sleep in the open air. These sounds gradually became familiar, a new rhythm that began to replace the village noises that had previously marked the passage of time. Sleep proved elusive. The ship's motion, while less violent than she had feared, remained sufficiently alien to keep her awareness sharp. Every creak of timber, every shift in the wind's sound, every change in the vessel's rhythm seemed to demand attention. She found herself listening for dangers she couldn't name, her body refusing to relax completely in such unfamiliar circumstances. Sometime near midnight, she heard footsteps approaching her shelter, followed by Rurik's voice calling softly, "Elska, are you awake?" "Yes, may I speak with you?" She pulled her cloak around her shoulders and stepped outside. The night sky was spectacular, more stars than she had ever seen, unobscured by the smoke and light of land-based settlements. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of diamonds, and the North Star shone with crystalline clarity above the compass stone. "I wanted to discuss your duties," Rurik said. "Tomorrow we reach Stavanger, one of the largest trading ports in these waters. You'll get your first real test as my advisor." "What kind of test?" "I have business with a merchant family that has been difficult in past dealings. They respect strength, but despise obvious displays of wealth or authority. They value directness but punish tactlessness. And they have a particular distrust of outsiders who arrive with large retinues." Elska nodded, beginning to understand. "You need someone who can read the situation and help you navigate their customs without appearing weak or offensive." "Exactly. Your background gives you advantages my usual associates lack. You understand poverty and pride. You know how to communicate respect without subservience, and you have no obvious stake in the outcome beyond serving my interests. What are we trading for?" "Iron ingots from their smelting operations, plus information about market conditions in the eastern settlements. Both are valuable, but the information may prove more important than the metal." They talked for another hour, with Rurik describing the complexities of interregional trade and the delicate relationships that made profitable ventures possible. Elska listened carefully, asking questions that revealed her quick grasp of the social and economic factors that drove his business. "You have good instincts," he said finally. "This arrangement may prove more beneficial than I initially anticipated." As he prepared to return to his own sleeping area, Elska found herself reluctant to end the conversation. "Rurik, may I ask you something personal?" "You may ask. I may not answer. Why do you travel alone? A man of your wealth and status could easily afford a permanent household, a wife, children of your own." For a long moment he was silent, his eyes fixed on the star-scattered sky. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Because permanent things can be taken away, and the pain of losing them is proportional to how much you value them. I learned that lesson young, and I learned it thoroughly." Before she could ask what he meant, he was walking away, his footsteps disappearing into the night sounds of the ship. Elska remained by the rail for several more minutes, watching the wake spread behind them like a phosphorescent road leading back to everything she had lost. When she finally returned to her shelter, sleep came more easily. The ship's motion had begun to feel natural rather than threatening, and the sounds of the crew had become a kind of lullaby. As consciousness faded, she found herself thinking about compass stones and their mysterious ability to find true north regardless of storms or confusion. Perhaps, she thought drowsily, she could learn to be like that, a reliable guide through unknown territory. helping others find their direction, even when her own path remained uncertain. Dawn brought Stavanger into view, a sprawling port city that dwarfed anything in Elska's experience. Where her village had numbered perhaps 200 souls, this settlement teemed with thousands. Smoke from countless hearth-fires created a haze that hung over the harbour like fog, and the waterfront bristled with masts from ships of every size and origin. Impressive, isn't it? Thorvald appeared beside her at the rail, chewing on a piece of dried fish. Been coming here for 15 years, and it still amazes me how much the place grows each season. Elska counted at least 50 vessels in the harbour, from sleek warships with dragon prows to fat-bellied merchant vessels designed for carrying cargo rather than speed. Men swarmed over the docks like ants, loading and unloading goods from regions she couldn't identify. The air carried a mixture of scents, tar and rope, foreign spices, the smoke of metalworking forges, and underneath it all, the sharp smell of fish and salt that marked any serious port. How do we find the people we're looking for in all this chaos? We don't find them, Rurik said, joining their conversation. They find us. Word of our arrival will reach the Grimson family before we finish tying up to the dock. They make it their business to know when ships with valuable cargo enter their harbour. As if summoned by his words, a small boat separated itself from the waterfront traffic and began rowing toward them. 3 men occupied the vessel, 2 rowers and a passenger whose clothing suggested wealth without ostentation. The passenger stood as they approached, cupping his hands around his mouth to call across the water. Rurik Thorson. Welcome back to Stavanger. Håkon Grimson, Rurik muttered, the youngest son and most ambitious member of the family. He'll want to establish the terms of engagement before we even reach shore. The small boat pulled alongside their longship, and Håkon Grimson climbed aboard with the easy confidence of someone who considered himself welcome everywhere. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of lean build that suggested more time spent in counting houses than training yards. His clothes were well-made but practical, and his hands bore the ink stains that marked a man who spent considerable time with ledgers and contracts. You've brought quite an impressive cargo this season, Håkon said, his eyes scanning the ship with obvious assessment. My sources tell me you've been collecting rare goods throughout the northern settlements. Your sources are well informed, as always. Rurik's tone was cordial but gave nothing away. I trust your family's enterprises continue to prosper. Indeed they do. Father has opened 2 new smelting operations this summer, and our iron production has increased substantially. We're in a position to offer very competitive prices for the right trading partners. Elska watched this exchange with fascination. Both men spoke with perfect politeness, while clearly maneuvering for advantage in negotiations that hadn't officially begun. Each statement carried multiple layers of meaning, and she began to understand why Rurik valued advisors who could read social undercurrents. I don't believe I've met your companion, Håkon said, his attention shifting to Elska with the calculating gaze of someone trying to determine her significance. Elska Magnusdottir, Rurik replied smoothly. She assists me in evaluating local customs and market conditions. The introduction was deliberately vague, leaving Håkon to guess whether she was a business partner, personal advisor, or something else entirely. Elska recognized the tactical value of this ambiguity. People revealed more when they weren't certain of their audience's status or loyalties. Welcome to Stavanger, Håkon said to her directly. I hope you'll find our hospitality worthy of your expectations. I'm sure I will, Elska replied carefully. I've heard impressive things about your family's reputation for fair dealing. Something in Håkon's expression sharpened at her response. She had managed to compliment his family, while subtly indicating that their reputation preceded them, a delicate balance between respect and implied scrutiny. As they approached the docks, Elska noticed that their arrival was attracting considerable attention. Dockworkers paused in their labors to watch their ship navigate the crowded harbor, and she spotted several well-dressed individuals who seemed to be taking mental notes of their cargo and crew. Popular fellow, aren't you? She murmured to Rurik. Successful traders are always watched closely. Everyone wants to know what goods are moving, where they came from, and where they're likely to go next. His voice was pitched low enough that only she could hear. Information is often more valuable than the physical cargo itself. They tied up at a dock that seemed reserved for vessels of particular importance. The pier was wider and better constructed than those nearby, and guards in matching livery stood at discreet intervals. Clearly, the Grimson family commanded significant respect in this port. "My father requests the honor of your company for an evening meal," Haken announced as they prepared to disembark. "He's eager to discuss the season's trading opportunities." "The honor would be ours," Rurik replied with a slight bow. "Excellent. Shall we say sunset at our family compound? I'll send guides to escort you from your lodgings." After Haken departed, Rurik turned to his crew. "Thorvald, see to securing the ship and arranging for fresh supplies. Eric, establish watches and make sure our cargo remains undisturbed. The rest of you have shore leave, but stay sober and stay out of trouble. We'll likely be sailing within 3 days." As they walked through the crowded streets of Stavanger, Elska was struck by the cosmopolitan nature of the place. She heard languages she didn't recognize, saw clothing styles from distant regions, and observed customs that would have seemed bizarre in her small fishing village. This was clearly a crossroads where cultures mixed and merged, creating something unique and constantly changing. Their lodgings proved to be a well-appointed inn that catered to prosperous merchants. Elska's room was small but comfortable, with real glass in the windows, and a bed that felt luxurious after sleeping on ship pallets. A servant brought heated water for washing and informed her that appropriate clothing for the evening's dinner had been provided. The dress that awaited her was a revelation. Made from fine wool, dyed a deep forest green, it was cut in the style favored by wealthy merchant families, practical enough for daily wear, but elegant enough to make a statement about the wearer's status. With it came a silver brooch, worked in an intricate Celtic pattern, and soft leather shoes that fit her feet perfectly. How did they know my measurements? She asked Rurik when they met in the inn's common room. Haken is very thorough in his preparations. He probably had someone assess your size while we were still aboard ship. Rurik himself had changed into clothes that transformed him from ship captain to successful trader. A tunic of midnight blue wool, a belt with silver fittings, and a cloak fastened with a brooch that displayed his family's raven symbol. "Do I look the part of a merchant's advisor?" "You look like someone worth listening to." "Which is exactly what we need tonight." The Grimson family compound occupied several acres near the center of Stavanger, surrounded by walls that served both defensive and display purposes. Guards at the gates wore matching armor and carried weapons of obvious quality, while the buildings within showed the kind of architectural refinement that required both wealth and sophisticated craftsmanship. Their host, Thorstein Grimson, proved to be a man in his 60s, with the kind of presence that filled rooms without effort. His hair had gone completely white, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. When he spoke, others listened, not from fear but from recognition that his words carried the weight of genuine wisdom and experience. "Rurik, my friend. Another successful season, I trust?" Thorstein's greeting was warm but measured. The careful cordiality of someone who understood that friendship and business required different kinds of trust. "Very successful. Thanks in part to the quality of goods your family provided last season." "Excellent. And this must be the advisor Haken mentioned." Thorstein turned his attention to Elska with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "Elska Magnusdottir, I believe." "Yes, my lord. None of that formal nonsense. We're all traders here, each contributing what we can to mutually profitable ventures." Thorstein gestured toward a long table laden with food and drink. "Come, let us eat and discuss the opportunities this season." Presents. The meal was elaborate by any standard Elska had. Known, multiple courses featuring both local specialties and exotic imports that demonstrated the family's extensive trading connections. Wine from southern vineyards, spices from eastern markets, preserved fruits from regions she couldn't identify. Each dish told a story of far-flung commercial relationships and the sophisticated logistics required to bring diverse goods together in one place. During the early courses, conversation remained general: weather patterns, political developments in various regions, news of other traders and their recent ventures. Elska listened carefully, beginning to understand the complex web of relationships that made large-scale commerce possible. Your advisor seems unusually attentive, Thorstein observed too. Rurik, most people lose focus when talk turns to trade, routes and market fluctuations. Elska has proven remarkably quick at grasping the connections between seemingly unrelated factors, Rurik replied. Her insights have already proven valuable in several recent negotiations. As the evening progressed, the conversation grew more specific. Thorstein described his family's expanded iron production capabilities and their need for reliable partners who could move finished goods to distant markets. Rurik outlined his access to northern hunting grounds and the luxury furs that commanded premium prices in southern cities. The challenge, Thorstein said, leaning back in his chair, is establishing fair terms that account for the risks each party assumes. Iron production requires substantial upfront investment, while trading ventures face uncertainties of weather, piracy, and fluctuating demand. Elska recognized this as the crucial moment when general discussion shifted toward actual negotiation. Both men were now testing the waters, trying to determine how far the other might be willing to bend on terms and conditions. Perhaps, she said carefully, the solution lies in sharing risks rather than assigning them to one party or the other. Both men turned their attention to her, and she felt the weight of their scrutiny. This was her first real test as Rurik's advisor, and the success or failure of this moment would determine how seriously they took her future contributions. Explain, Thorstein said simply. If iron production requires substantial investment, then traders who want access to the best quality goods should contribute to that investment in exchange for guaranteed availability and favorable pricing. Similarly, if trading ventures face uncertainties, then producers who benefit from expanded markets should share the costs of insurance and protection. Thorstein stroked his beard thoughtfully. Interesting. Joint investment, shared risk, mutual dependence. It creates incentives for both parties to ensure the other's success, Elska continued. A producer who has traders' investment in his operations will prioritize quality and reliability. Traders who have producers' investment in their ventures will work harder to develop new markets and maintain customer relationships. And what of profits? Hakon asked. How would returns be divided under such an arrangement? Proportional to investment and risk assumed, Elska replied without hesitation, with additional compensation for expertise and specialized knowledge that one party brings to the partnership. The room fell silent as both sides considered the implications of her proposal. Elska realized she had just suggested a fundamental restructuring of how these families conducted business, moving from simple buyer-seller relationships toward something approaching true partnership. Your advisor has a sophisticated understanding of commercial relationships, Thorstein said to Rurik. Where did she acquire such knowledge? Sometimes the best insights come from outside traditional merchant families, Rurik replied diplomatically. Fresh perspectives can reveal opportunities that experience might overlook. As they walked back to their lodgings later that evening, Rurik was unusually quiet. Elska found herself wondering whether her interventions had helped or hindered his negotiations. Did I speak out of turn? She asked finally. On the contrary, you may have just revolutionized how I approach partnership agreements. Rurik stopped walking and turned to face her. That was brilliant analysis, delivered with exactly the right mixture of confidence and deference. Will they accept your proposal? They'll need time to consider the implications, but yes, I believe they will. The logic is too compelling to ignore, and Thorstein is pragmatic enough to recognize a superior arrangement when he sees one. As they reached the inn, Rurik paused at the entrance. "I'm beginning to understand that this arrangement may change both of us in ways we didn't anticipate." That night, as Elska lay in her comfortable bed, listening to the sounds of a city that never quite slept, she found herself thinking about the small wooden horse she had glimpsed in Rurik's personal effects aboard ship. Such a simple toy, carefully preserved among the possessions of a man who claimed to avoid permanent attachments. What story did it tell about the experiences that had shaped him? And why did someone who professed to value independence carry reminders of connections that obviously still mattered? The questions followed her into dreams filled with compass stones and carved horses, iron ingots and silver brooches, all spinning together in patterns she couldn't quite decipher, but somehow knew were important. 3 days later, as their ship carved through morning swells toward the next port, Elska found herself studying Rurik with new awareness. The successful negotiations in Stavanger had shifted something between them, a subtle change from wary cooperation toward something approaching genuine partnership. She noticed how he sought her opinion on matters he might once have decided alone, how he listened to her observations with the focused attention he typically reserved for navigational calculations. "The wind's shifting," Thorvald announced from his position near the mast. "Storm building to the northwest. Might catch us before we reach Trondheim." Rurik moved to the ship's rail. Rurik moved to the ship's rail, his experienced eye reading signs in cloud formations and wave patterns that remained invisible to Elska. "How long before it hits?" 4 hours, maybe 5 if we're fortunate. Can we outrun it?" "Not likely. This beauty's fast, but storms move faster when they have their minds set on traveling." Elska watched Rurik weigh their options, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the silver arm ring he wore, a gesture she had begun to recognize as his way of centering himself during difficult decisions. The ring was clearly old, its surface worn smooth by years of such contact, and she found herself wondering about its history. Who had given it to him? What memories did it carry? "We'll make for Molde," Rurik decided. "Better to wait out rough weather in a safe harbor than risk damage trying to beat it to our destination." As the crew adjusted course toward the sheltered fjord that housed the smaller trading port, dark clouds began building on the horizon like a wall of approaching night. The wind picked up steadily, carrying the sharp scent of rain and the electric tension that preceded serious storms. "Ever been through a real tempest at sea?" Eric Iron Hand asked Elska as he secured loose rigging. "Nothing worse than fishing weather," she admitted. "This'll be different. Ship this size rides the big waves instead of fighting them, but it can be unsettling for those not used to it." Eric's scarred hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked their preparations. "The best thing is to find something solid to hold on to and remember that we've all survived worse." The storm caught them just as the entrance to Molde's harbor came into view. Rain began as scattered drops that quickly escalated to driving sheets that stung exposed skin and turned the deck treacherous. Wind howled through the rigging with a voice that seemed almost alive, and waves that had been manageable swells became rolling mountains of dark water. Elska retreated to her canvas shelter as spray began washing over the rails. But she found the enclosed space more frightening than the open deck. Unable to see what was happening, every sound seemed magnified and threatening. The ship would climb what felt like an impossible slope, pause at the crest with a sickening moment of weightlessness, then plunge down the far side with enough force to rattle her teeth. "This is madness," she muttered, gripping the wooden frame of her sleeping pallet. "Actually, this is rather routine," came Rurik's voice from outside her shelter. "May I come in?" She opened the canvas flap to find him soaked through but grinning with what appeared to be genuine enjoyment. "You're enjoying this?" "There's something pure about fighting weather," he said, settling beside her on the narrow pallet. "No politics, no complex negotiations, no hidden motivations. Just wind and water and the skills to survive them." His presence filled the small space, and Elska became acutely aware of his warmth and the clean scent of rain on wool. Outside, the storm continued its assault. But somehow his confidence made the chaos seem less threatening. "Tell me about the ring," she said, gesturing toward the silver band on his wrist. Rurik looked down at the ornament as if surprised to find it there. "What about it?" "You touch it when you're making difficult decisions. It clearly means something to you." For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, barely audible above the storm's noise. "It belonged to my son." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. In all their conversations, he had never mentioned family, children, any personal connections that might explain his solitary existence. "Your son?" "Magnus. He would have been 12 this summer." Rurik's fingers traced the ring's worn surface. "He died 4 years ago, along with his mother, during a fever outbreak in Bergen." Elska felt her heart clench with sympathetic pain. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I don't speak of it often. Most people offer meaningless comfort or assume that time heals all wounds." His grey eyes met hers. "But you've lost people too. You understand that some injuries never fully close?" She thought of her father, probably already dead in his cold hut, and her mother, who existed only in fragments of memory and a simple iron brooch. "How do you bear it?" "By remembering that love doesn't disappear just because the person is gone. Magnus gave me this ring on my last birthday with him, said it would help me remember that he would always be part of whatever I accomplished." Rurik's voice grew stronger. "So I carry him with me, and his memory shapes the choices I make." The storm seemed to pause around them, as if the natural world recognized the weight of shared grief. In the strange intimacy of the small shelter, with rain drumming overhead and the ship rolling beneath them, Elska felt barriers dissolving that had existed since their first meeting. "Is that why you travel alone?" "To avoid forming new attachments that might be lost." "Partly. But also because I learned that caring for people makes you vulnerable in ways that have nothing to do with emotional pain." Rurik shifted position, and their shoulders touched. "Business rivals who know you have family will use them as leverage. Enemies who want to hurt you will target those you love. Sometimes isolation is the kindest protection you can offer, but doesn't it get lonely?" "Terribly." "But loneliness is survivable, while losing people you love." He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Elska found herself reaching for his hand, covering the silver ring with her fingers. "Thank you for telling me. It helps me understand why you were willing to accept my offer, and why you've been so careful to maintain distance between us." "Have I been maintaining distance?" The question caught her off guard. Looking at their current position, sitting close together on her sleeping pallet, hands touching, voices intimate with shared secrets, she realized that whatever distance had existed was rapidly disappearing. "Perhaps not as much as you intended," she said softly. "Perhaps not." His free hand moved to touch her face, fingers tracing the line of her cheek with surprising gentleness. "You're not what I expected when I agreed to our arrangement." "What did you expect?" "Someone grateful for rescue, willing to serve without question, content to remain in the background while I conducted my business." His thumb brushed across her lips. "Instead, I found someone who challenges me to think differently, who sees opportunities I miss, who makes me remember why I once enjoyed having companions." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to fully explore. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. The wind's howl diminishing to a steady moan, and the rain's assault softening to persistent drumming. "The weather's clearing," Elska observed. "Yes, it is," but neither of them moved to leave the shelter. Instead, they remained close together, hands still touching, each seeming to understand that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we reach Molde, conduct our business, and continue toward Trondheim. The immediate future remains unchanged, and the longer future, that depends on many factors, most of which remain beyond our control." Rurik's expression grew serious. "But I want you to know that whatever develops between us, your contract remains inviolate. You agreed to 7 years of service, and those terms will be honored regardless of any personal feelings that might arise." She understood what he was trying to say, that he wouldn't use his position to coerce her into intimacy, that whatever might grow between them would have to be freely chosen by both parties. The assurance should have comforted her, but instead it left her feeling strangely disappointed. And if I wanted those terms to change, then we would need to discuss what changes would serve both our interests. His voice was carefully neutral. But such conversations should happen when we're not confined together by circumstance, when you have time to consider all implications without pressure. The wisdom of his caution was obvious, but Elska found herself resenting it anyway. The man who had seemed so coldly calculating during their first meeting was revealing depths of consideration and honor that made him far more attractive than simple wealth or authority ever could. "You're a complicated man, Rurik Thorson, as are you a complicated woman, Elska Magnusdottir." When they finally emerged from the shelter, the storm had passed, and Molde's harbour lay before them like a haven of calm water and welcoming lights. The crew worked with renewed energy to bring them safely to dock, their movements reflecting the satisfaction of successfully weathering another challenge. As Elska helped secure loose equipment, she noticed the crew treating her with subtle but unmistakable changes in attitude. Word of her success in Stavanger had spread, and they now regarded her less as Rurik's burden and more as a valued member of their small community. Good thinking in that negotiation, Bjorn the navigator told her as they worked together to coil wet rope. Shared risk arrangements make sense when you're dealing with people you plan to work with long term. Thank you. I'm still learning how all these relationships fit together. You're learning fast. Rurik's not easy to impress, but he's been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen. The comment warmed her more than it probably should have. Professional recognition was one thing, but earning the personal approval of someone she was beginning to care about felt significantly more important. That evening, as they shared a meal in Molde's best inn, Elska found herself studying the small details that revealed Rurik's character. How he remembered the names of serving girls and thanked them for their service. How he listened to tavern gossip with the focused attention of someone who understood that information could be as valuable as gold. How he deflected questions about his personal life while encouraging others to share their stories. Most revealing of all was a moment when a young boy approached their table, drawn by the quality of Rurik's clothes and the obvious prosperity they represented. Instead of dismissing the child or offering empty charity, Rurik engaged him in conversation about his family's circumstances and ended up arranging work for the boy's father with one of the local merchants. "You do that often?" Elska asked after the child left. "Do what?" "Find ways to help people without making them feel like beggars, when I can. Prosperity creates obligations, and those who forget that usually don't stay prosperous long." Later, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Rurik paused at the top of the inn's stairs. "Elska, about our conversation during the storm, yes? I want you to know that regardless of what develops between us personally, I've come to value your counsel more than I can adequately express. You've already exceeded any reasonable expectations for this arrangement, only 3 months into a 7-year contract. Perhaps the contract will need to be renegotiated before those 7 years expire." The possibility hung between them like a promise, full of potential but requiring careful nurturing to reach fruition. As Elska settled into her bed that night, she found herself thinking not about the storm they had weathered, but about the ancient runestone she had seen embedded in Molde's harbour wall, an artifact so old its meaning had been forgotten, yet somehow still conveying the sense that important decisions had been made in its presence. Some choices, she realized, echo through time in ways their makers never anticipate. Her decision to accept Rurik's terms had been made to preserve her father's honor, but it was becoming something far more complex, a journey of discovery that was changing both of them in ways neither had foreseen. The revelation came in Trondheim, 3 weeks after the storm that had brought them closer together. Elska was examining trade goods in the market square when a familiar voice called her name from across the crowded plaza. She turned to see Olaf Ragnarsson, a trader who had occasionally visited her village, pushing through the throng with obvious urgency. "Elska Magnusdotter, by Thor's hammer, what are you doing so far from home?" She embraced the older man, genuinely pleased to see a face from her past. "Olaf, I'm traveling with Rurik Thorsson on business matters. How do you come to be in Trondheim?" "Same as always, buying amber and selling iron tools. But more importantly, I bring news from Cavernum." His weathered face grew serious. "Your father passed peacefully 2 days after you left. The village gave him a proper burial, and Erik Olafsson spoke well of his honor." The news hit her like an expected blow that still managed to stagger. She had known Magnus was dying, had prepared herself for this moment, yet hearing the confirmation brought fresh grief flooding through her chest. "Thank you for telling me," she managed. "I'm grateful he didn't suffer long. There's more, child. After the funeral, some of us began talking about your father's debt to that trader. Something about the whole arrangement troubled me, so I did some investigating." Elska felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What kind of investigating?" "I knew Magnus from our boyhood, knew him to be careful with money and honest in his dealings. The idea that he would borrow such an enormous sum seemed unlikely." Olaf reached into his traveling pouch and withdrew a folded parchment. "So I visited Bergen and spoke with the Guild of Moneylenders about their records." Her hands trembled as she accepted the document. "What did you find?" "See for yourself." The parchment was a certified copy of loan records from the Bergen Guild, bearing official seals and signatures. Elska's eyes scanned the entries until she found her father's name, and what she saw made her stomach lurch with sudden understanding. Magnus Eriksson, 20 pieces of silver, loaned at standard interest rates. Total repayment required, 35 pieces. Status, satisfied in full, 2 seasons past. "This can't be correct," she whispered. The debt was for 50 pieces, growing to 100 with compound interest. That's what I thought when I first saw it. "So I asked to examine the original documentation." Olaf's expression was grim. "Your father borrowed 20 pieces, not 50. Standard guild interest, not the compound calculations Rurik claimed. And according to their records, the debt was paid in full nearly 2 years ago." The implications crashed over her like a breaking wave. If these records were accurate, then her father had died, believing himself dishonored when he was actually free of obligation. Her sacrifice, their entire arrangement, the contract that bound her to 7 years of service, all of it based on fraudulent claims. But why would Rurik... She stopped, unable to complete the thought. "I can't speak to his motivations, but I can tell you that what happened to your family has happened before. I made inquiries among traders who know his reputation." Olaf lowered his voice. "Rurik Thorsson is known for collecting debts that don't exist, using forged documents and inflated calculations to trap families into impossible situations. That's not possible. He's respected throughout the northern ports. His business relationships are built on a foundation of legitimate trade mixed with systematic fraud. The legitimate business provides cover for the illegal activities." Olaf's hand settled on her shoulder with fatherly concern. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news, but I thought you should know the truth." Elska stared at the document until the letters blurred together. Everything she thought she understood about her situation, about Rurik, about the honorable arrangement she believed they had forged, was crumbling around her like a structure built on sand. "There's something else," Olaf continued reluctantly. "The guild keeps records of complaints filed against their members. Rurik has been accused of document forgery and debt manipulation at least 6 times in the past 5 years. No formal charges have been brought because the victims usually disappear, sold into slavery or simply vanishing from their home communities. But my contract, the terms are generous, more like partnership than indenture. A man who destroys families for profit doesn't suddenly develop conscience. If he's treating you well, it's because you serve some purpose beyond simple labor. The marketplace around them continued its normal bustle, but Elska felt disconnected from the everyday reality of commerce and conversation. The careful trust she had been building with Rurik, the growing attraction she had been fighting, the respect she had earned through successful negotiations, all of it was contaminated by the possibility that she was nothing more than an elaborate deception. What should I do? Come with me. I can arrange passage back to Cavernum, or to any other settlement where you might want to start fresh. The contract binding you to Rurik is invalid if it was obtained through fraud. Elska looked toward the harbour, where Rurik's ship floated at anchor, its dragon prow gleaming in the afternoon sun. Somewhere aboard that vessel was the man who had shared his deepest grief with her, who had spoken of his dead son with genuine pain, who had treated her with consideration and respect she had never expected. I need to confront him with this evidence. Elska, no. Men who build their fortunes on fraud don't hesitate to eliminate threats to their security. If he realizes you know the truth, then I'll know what kind of man he really is. Olaf shook his head. You'll know when you're dead or sold to slavers bound for foreign markets. This isn't a game, child. Rurik Thorson is dangerous. But even as she heard the warnings, Elska found herself reluctant to simply flee. The man who had revealed his vulnerability during the storm, who had shown genuine interest in her opinions and insights, who had treated her as an equal partner in complex negotiations, could that person really be an elaborate fabrication? Give me one day, she said finally. If I'm not back by tomorrow evening, assume the worst and do whatever you think best. This is madness, perhaps, but I need to know the truth. She made her way back to their lodgings with the forged document hidden beneath her cloak, her mind churning with questions and fears. How could she have been so naive? The signs had been there, his reluctance to discuss his business practices in detail, the way his crew seemed more like guards than sailors, the suspicious ease with which he had agreed to her modified terms. Rurik was waiting in the inn's common room, examining what appeared to be correspondence from other ports. He looked up as she entered, and the warmth in his expression made her heart ache with the possibility that even this small gesture might be calculated manipulation. You look troubled, he observed. Did the market negotiations go poorly? I need to speak with you privately. Something in her tone made him set aside his letters and give her his full attention. Of course. Shall we go to your room? No, somewhere public but quiet. The inn's garden, perhaps. If he found her request strange, he gave no indication. They settled on a bench beneath an apple tree, whose branches provided privacy while keeping them within sight of the inn's other guests. I met someone from my village today, Elska began carefully. He brought news of my father's death. I'm sorry for your loss. Magnus seemed like an honorable man. He also brought something else. She withdrew the parchment from beneath her cloak. Documentation from the Bergen Guild of Moneylenders regarding my father's debt to you. Rurik's expression didn't change, but she noticed his hand move unconsciously toward his silver arm ring. What kind of documentation? Records showing that my father borrowed 20 pieces of silver, not 50. Records showing that the debt was repaid in full nearly 2 years ago. She placed the parchment on the bench between them. Records that make our entire arrangement appear to be based on fraudulent claims. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. A bee droned among the apple blossoms, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of normal life continuing, conversations, laughter, the everyday activities of people whose worlds hadn't just collapsed. What do you want me to say? Rurik asked finally. I want you to explain how guild records could be so different from the contract you showed my father. I want you to tell me why a debt that was satisfied 2 years ago suddenly became grounds for indenturing his daughter. And if I told you that the guild records are incomplete, that your father had additional obligations not recorded in their ledgers, then I would ask to see documentation of those obligations. And if I told you that some business relationships exist outside formal guild oversight, that not all debts are recorded in public ledgers, then I would wonder why a man who claims to value honor and reputation would engage in arrangements that require such secrecy. Rurik stood and moved to the garden's stone wall, his back toward her as he gazed out at the harbor. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness she had never heard before. Your father's original debt was exactly as the guild records indicate. 20 pieces of silver, repaid according to standard terms. The admission hit her like a physical blow, even though she had been preparing herself for exactly this revelation. Then why? Because I needed someone with your particular combination of intelligence, integrity, and desperation. Someone who would serve willingly rather than resentfully. Someone who could be trusted with sensitive business matters. Someone who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions about the sources of my wealth. You destroyed my family for your convenience. I gave you an opportunity to preserve your family's honor while gaining skills and connections that will serve you well long after our contract expires. Rurik turned to face her, and she was shocked to see what appeared to be genuine regret in his expression. Your father would have died believing himself dishonored. This way he died knowing his daughter had found a path forward, based on lies, based on a mutually beneficial arrangement that has already proven its value. You've helped me secure more profitable contracts in 3 months than I typically manage in an entire year. In exchange, you've gained education and experience that will make you valuable to any trading enterprise. Elska felt anger building in her chest, hot and clean and clarifying. You speak of mutual benefit, but only one of us was free to choose whether the arrangement continued, and now you are free to choose. The truth is revealed, the deception exposed. You can leave immediately with appropriate compensation, or you can recognize that our partnership has value regardless of how it began. Partnership. The word came out sharp with incredulity. How can there be partnership between us when it's built on fundamental dishonesty? Because what we've built together is real, regardless of its origins. The respect I have for your abilities is genuine. The success we've achieved in negotiations is based on your actual skills, not manipulation or fraud. He stopped himself. The what? The feelings that have developed between us are not part of any deception. Despite her anger, despite the betrayal burning in her chest, Elska felt her resolve waver. The pain in his voice sounded authentic, and the admission of feelings he had tried so hard to keep controlled seemed to cost him considerable effort. How can I trust anything you say now? You can't. Trust is built through actions over time, and I've undermined that foundation by beginning our relationship with deception. Rurik moved closer, but stopped just beyond arm's reach. But I'm asking you to consider that people can change, that partnerships can grow beyond their origins, that what? That I should simply forgive and forget because you've discovered inconvenient emotions. That you should decide what serves your interests best, now that you know the complete truth. Elska stood and began pacing, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. She had been naive to trust so completely, but that didn't negate everything she had learned and accomplished. Her success in negotiations had been real, her growing confidence genuine, her expanding understanding of trade and commerce valuable, regardless of how she had acquired it. If I stay, the terms change completely. Name your conditions, equal partnership. Shared profits from all ventures I help negotiate. Freedom to leave at any time without penalty. And complete honesty about all aspects of your business, including any activities that might be considered questionable. Agreed. And if I discover any further deceptions, any evidence that you're continuing to defraud other families, our arrangement ends immediately. Also agreed. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why agree to terms that eliminate virtually all your advantages? Rurik was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer at all. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, because losing you would be worse than losing profit. Because you've made me remember what it feels like to have someone I can trust completely. Because the man I've become working with you is better than the man I was before we met. The words hung between them like a bridge, fragile, requiring careful crossing, but offering the possibility of reaching solid ground on the other side. Elska realized that her anger was beginning to transform into something more complex, a mixture of hurt and hope that defied simple categorization. "I need time to think." "Of course. Take all the time you need." As she walked away from the garden, Elska felt the weight of a decision that would reshape her entire future. Behind her, she could sense Rurik watching her go, and she wondered if he understood that he had just admitted to feelings that made him as vulnerable as she was. The forged document crinkled in her hand as she climbed the stairs to her room, a reminder that some betrayals could be forgiven while others could never be forgotten. Which category this deception fell into remained to be determined. Elska spent the night walking the streets of Trondheim, her mind churning through the impossible complexity of her situation. Dawn found her sitting on the harbour wall, watching fishing boats return with their morning catch, while she wrestled with a decision that would define the rest of her life. The revelation of Rurik's deception had shattered her understanding of their relationship, yet she couldn't deny the genuine growth she had experienced in his service. The woman who had left Cavernum 4 months ago, desperate, uneducated in the ways of commerce, limited by the narrow horizons of village life, no longer existed. In her place sat someone who could negotiate with wealthy merchants, analyze complex trade relationships, and command respect in rooms where such respect had to be earned rather than given. Complicated thoughts for such an early hour. Came a familiar voice behind her. She turned to find Olaf Ragnarsson, approaching with 2 steaming cups of ale. "You didn't go back to your ship last night." "I was concerned. I needed time to think without the pressure of immediate decision." Olaf settled beside her on the wall, offering one of the cups. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That the world is more complex than I understood when I was younger." Elska wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for its heat against the morning chill. "Rurik deceived me about the debt, but everything else, the respect, the opportunities, the partnership he's offering, those appear genuine. Or they could be elaborate manipulations designed to secure your continued cooperation. Perhaps. But if so, they're manipulations that have genuine value. I've learned skills that will serve me regardless of what I decide about our arrangement." Olaf studied her face with the concern of someone who had known her since childhood. "You're considering staying with him?" "I'm considering accepting his offer of equal partnership, yes, after he's admitted to destroying your family for his personal convenience." The blunt words stung because they carried undeniable truth. Whatever justifications Rurik offered, whatever genuine feelings might have developed between them, the foundation of their relationship remained built on calculated cruelty. "My family was already destroyed," Elska said quietly. "My father was dying. Our debts were real, even if smaller than claimed, and our prospects were limited regardless of Rurik's intervention. What he offered was a path forward that preserved our honor while providing opportunities I never could have imagined. Opportunities that came at the cost of your freedom." "Freedom to do what?" "Remain in Cavernum as a fisherman's daughter, marry some local man, bear children in poverty, and watch them face the same limited choices that defined my own youth." Elska shook her head. "That isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of cage." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the harbour come alive with the day's activities. Merchant vessels were beginning to stir, crews preparing for departures or arrivals. The endless cycle of commerce that connected distant communities in webs of mutual dependence. "There's something else you should know," Olaf said eventually. "The accusations against Rurik, they're not just suspicions. The Bergen Guild is actively investigating his activities, and they have evidence of systematic fraud spanning several years." Elska felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of evidence?" "Forged documents, falsified interest calculations, families that have disappeared after defaulting on debts that may never have existed." Olaf's voice was grim. If the guild's suspicions are confirmed, Rurik could face charges that carry penalties up to and including death. When? Soon. The guild investigators are gathering final testimonies from victims and witnesses. They expect to bring formal charges within the next month. The implications crashed over her like a breaking wave. If Rurik was arrested and convicted, what would happen to his crew, his ship, his legitimate business operations? More personally, what would happen to her? Even as his equal partner, she would be associated with his crimes in the minds of those who mattered in commercial circles. Does he know? If he doesn't, he's less intelligent than his reputation suggests. A man who builds his fortune on fraud doesn't survive long without keeping careful watch for threats to his security. Elska stood and began pacing along the harbor wall, her mind racing through possibilities and complications. If Rurik knew about the investigation, then his offer of partnership might be motivated less by genuine feelings than by the need for allies when his world collapsed. But if he was truly innocent of the worst accusations, then the investigation represented a threat to everything they might build together. I need to warn him. Elska, no. If he's guilty of what they suspect, then warning him makes you an accomplice. If he's innocent, then the investigation will clear his name without your intervention. And if he's guilty of some things but not others, if the truth is more complex than either complete innocence or complete guilt. Olaf's expression grew troubled. Then you're walking into a situation that could destroy you regardless of your good intentions. Despite the wisdom of his warnings, Elska found herself unwilling to simply abandon the man who had shared his deepest pain with her, who had admitted his deceptions and offered to make amends. Whatever his past crimes, whatever danger the investigation represented, she couldn't bring herself to disappear without giving him the chance to explain or defend himself. I have to make my own choices. Just as he made his, then at least be careful. And remember that you have friends who will help you regardless of what happens with this trader. She embraced Olaf gratefully, understanding that he had risked considerable trouble to bring her the truth about her situation. Thank you for caring enough to interfere in my affairs. Your father was a good man who deserved better than he received. The least I could do was ensure his daughter knew the complete truth. As Elska made her way back through Trondheim's winding streets, she noticed details that had escaped her attention before. The number of beggars, many of them former fishermen or farmers who had lost their livelihoods to debts they couldn't repay. The suspicious glances that followed well-dressed strangers, particularly those who might be moneylenders or debt collectors. The wariness in merchants' eyes when they discussed terms for loans or credit arrangements. Rurik's activities, if the accusations were true, were part of a larger pattern of exploitation that left communities poorer and families destroyed. Yet the man she had come to know seemed incapable of the systematic cruelty such activities required. The contradiction gnawed at her, demanding resolution. She found him in the inn's common room, methodically packing documents and correspondence into a leather satchel. His movements had the careful precision of someone preparing for a journey, and she noticed that his most valuable possessions had been gathered and secured. "You're leaving," she observed. "We're leaving, if you've decided to accept my offer of partnership. If not, then yes, I'm departing alone." "When?" "Within the hour. There are matters requiring my attention in the southern settlements, and delays could prove costly." His urgency seemed to confirm Olaf's warnings about the guild investigation. Whatever his reasons for haste, they were compelling enough to abandon potentially profitable negotiations in Trondheim. "Rurik, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty." He looked up from his packing, and she saw wariness in his expression. "Ask. Are you fleeing from legal charges?" For a moment, she thought he would deflect or deny. Instead, he set down his satchel and met her gaze directly. "The Bergen Guild has been investigating irregularities in several debt collection cases. Some of those cases involve transactions I facilitated, though not necessarily transactions I initiated." "What does that mean?" "It means that the world of commercial lending is complex. that not all business relationships are documented in official records, and that guild investigators sometimes see fraud where more experienced practitioners see creative problem-solving. The careful phrasing was revealing in its precision. He was admitting to activities that skirted legal boundaries without confessing to outright criminality, and my father's case was handled exactly as I described to you yesterday. The original debt existed and was legitimately satisfied. The additional obligations that bound you to my service existed outside guild oversight, but were not fabricated. What additional obligations? Rurik hesitated, and she saw him weighing how much truth he could afford to reveal. Your father signed a guarantee for another man's debt, a man who subsequently defaulted and disappeared. By the terms of that guarantee, Magnus became responsible for the unpaid balance. Who was this other man? Someone who no longer matters to our current situation. The evasion was maddening, but Elska sensed that pressing for details would only encourage more careful lies. Instead, she focused on the implications of what he had admitted. So my father did owe money, just not the amount or under the terms you originally claimed. Correct. And you manipulated the situation to secure my services under terms more favorable to you than honest disclosure would have allowed. Also correct, but you're claiming that the guild investigation threatens you unjustly, that you're guilty of poor judgment rather than criminal fraud. I'm claiming that the line between aggressive business practices and illegal activity is often drawn by people who have never faced the complexities of real commercial relationships. Elska stared at him, trying to read the truth behind his carefully constructed explanations. Part of her wanted to believe that he was essentially honest, but trapped in circumstances beyond his control. Another part recognized that his explanations contained enough gaps and qualifications to hide significant deceptions. If I come with you, where are we going? South to the Orkney Islands, then west to Iceland. I have business interests there that are both legitimate and profitable. And after that, we establish ourselves in communities where my reputation is based on recent actions rather than old accusations. We build a trading enterprise based on the partnership model you suggested, using your skills and my resources to create something better than what either of us could achieve alone. It was a compelling vision. Escape from the complications of the past. The chance to start fresh in a new place. The opportunity to build something meaningful together. Yet Elska couldn't ignore the possibility that she was being offered a carefully constructed fantasy designed to secure her cooperation during his flight from justice. I need one thing. From you before I decide. Name it, she moved to his traveling chest and began searching through his carefully organized possessions until she found what she sought, the small wooden horse she had glimpsed months earlier. The toy was exquisitely carved, showing signs of loving use and careful preservation. Tell me about this. Tell me about your son, about his mother, about what really happened to them. Rurik's face went pale, and she saw his hand move instinctively toward his silver arm ring. Why? Because I need to know if the man who shared that pain with me was real, or if he was just another manipulation designed to secure my sympathy. The silence stretched between them until she wondered if he would answer at all. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. His name was Magnus, like your father. He was born in Bergen 5 years ago, the son of a woman named Astrid, who died bringing him into the world. Rurik's fingers closed around the wooden horse with obvious reverence. I carved this for his 2nd birthday, and he carried it everywhere until the fever took him. And their deaths? Were they really caused by disease, or did they die because of something connected to your business activities? The question struck him like a physical blow, and she saw genuine anguish flash across his features. They died because I wasn't there to protect them, because I was pursuing profitable ventures in distant ports while my family needed me at home. Their deaths were my fault, but not in the way you're suggesting. The pain in his voice was too raw, too immediate to be fabricated. Whatever else he might have lied about, his grief for his lost family was absolutely genuine. And the ring. Magnus gave it to me the morning I left, on what proved to be my final voyage before their deaths. He said it would help me remember to come home safely. Rurik's voice broke slightly. I've worn it every day since, as both reminder and penance. Elska felt her heart clench with sympathetic pain, even as her mind continued analyzing his responses for signs of deception. The man before her was clearly carrying genuine grief, but that didn't necessarily absolve him of the crimes he was accused of. If I come with you, and we discover that you've lied to me again about anything significant, I will leave immediately regardless of our partnership agreement. Understood. And if the guild investigators are right about your past activities, if you've truly destroyed families for profit, then you'll face those consequences regardless of what feelings might exist between us. Also understood. She looked around the common room one final time, knowing that her next words would commit her to a path she couldn't predict or control. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Rurik's crew preparing their ship for departure, and she realized that time for deliberation had expired. Then we leave together, as partners. The relief that flooded his expression was so profound that she understood for the first time how afraid he had been of losing her. Whatever his crimes, whatever deceptions still lay hidden between them, his feelings for her were absolutely real. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to depart, Elska fingered the wooden horse he had allowed her to hold. Such a simple toy, carved with love by a father for his son, preserved through years of grief as a tangible connection to better times. Like her mother's iron brooch, it represented the power of love to transcend loss, the human capacity to carry hope through the darkest circumstances. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths remained to be discovered, she was choosing to risk everything on the possibility that people could change, that partnerships could overcome their flawed beginnings, that two damaged souls might find healing in each other's company. The harbor wind carried the scent of distant storms as they boarded Rurik's ship, and Elska wondered if she was sailing towards salvation or catastrophe. Only time would reveal whether her faith in redemption was wisdom or folly. 3 days out from Trondheim, pursuing winds toward the Orkney Islands, their ship was intercepted by a vessel flying the banner of the Bergen Guild of Moneylenders. The guild ship was smaller, but faster than Rurik's trading vessel, built for pursuit rather than cargo capacity, and it had clearly been tracking them since their departure from Norway. Guild investigators, Thorvald announced grimly as the pursuing vessel closed the distance between them. They're signaling for us to heave to and prepare for boarding. Rurik stood at the stern rail, his hand resting on the pommel of his father's sword, an ancient weapon that had been passed down through 5 generations of his family. The blade bore runes along its fuller, worn nearly smooth by centuries of handling, and its grip was wrapped in leather that had been darkened by the touch of countless hands. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of honor and legacy that connected him to ancestors who had faced their own moments of moral reckoning. We could outrun them, Eric Ironhand suggested quietly. This wind favors our larger sail, and we know these waters better than they do. Running would be an admission of guilt, Rurik replied, and it would make outlaws of my entire crew. Elska moved to stand beside him, her eyes fixed on the approaching vessel. What will they want? To search the ship for evidence of fraudulent documents, to question crew members about suspicious activities, and to arrest me if they believe they have sufficient cause. Rurik's voice was steady, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. The question is whether they're operating on evidence or suspicion. As the guild ship drew alongside, Elska could see armed men preparing to board. Their leader was a tall, severe-looking man in his 50s, wearing the formal robes that marked him as a senior guild investigator. He carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Rurik Thorson, the investigator called across the water. I am Gunnar Eriksson, chief investigator for the Bergen Guild. By the authority granted to me under maritime commercial law, I demand permission to board your vessel and examine your business records. Permission granted, Rurik called back. "We have nothing to hide from legitimate guild oversight." The boarding took place with professional efficiency. 6 armed men crossed to their ship, while Gunnar Eriksson followed with 2 assistants carrying satchels of documents. The crew of Rurik's vessel watched with obvious tension, hands resting near weapons, but maintaining careful discipline. "This is a formal investigation into allegations of document forgery, debt manipulation and fraudulent business practices," Gunnar announced once he had assembled the ship's company on deck. "Anyone found to have assisted in illegal activities will face appropriate penalties under guild law." Elska noticed that several crew members exchanged worried glances, but none seemed surprised by the accusations. Whatever Rurik's activities had involved, at least some of his men had been aware of their questionable nature. "I assume you have warrants and evidence to support these allegations," Rurik said calmly. Gunnar withdrew a rolled parchment from his satchel. "Formal accusations filed by 7 families, supported by documentation showing systematic patterns of fraudulent debt inflation and forged collection documents. May I examine the specific charges?" "You may." Gunnar unrolled the parchment and handed it to Rurik, "though I suspect you're already familiar with most of these cases." As Rurik read through the accusations, Elska watched his expression carefully. She saw recognition, concern, and what might have been resignation, but not the surprise or outrage she would have expected from an innocent man. "These charges cover activities spanning 3 years, Rurik observed. "Some involved legitimate business disputes, where terms were interpreted differently by the parties involved, and others involved clear evidence of document forgery and systematic fraud." Gunnar replied sharply, "including the use of false contracts to coerce families into slavery arrangements." The accusation hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Elska felt every eye on the ship turned toward her, recognizing that she represented exactly the kind of victim Gunnar was describing. "This is Elska Magnusdottir," Rurik said clearly. "She entered service under a legitimate contract that has been honored according to its terms. She is free to speak for herself regarding any aspect of our arrangement." Gunnar's attention fixed on her with sharp intensity. "Elska Magnusdottir of Kvernum, daughter of Magnus Eriksson?" "Yes. Your case was specifically brought to our attention by traders who questioned the circumstances of your indenture." Gunnar stepped closer, his manner shifting from official authority to something approaching gentleness. "We have documentation showing that your father's debt was satisfied in full nearly 2 years before Rurik Thorsson appeared at your village." Elska felt the weight of every gaze on the ship. Her response would either support or destroy the man who had become her partner, her teacher, and something approaching her lover. The truth was complex, but the investigators would likely interpret complexity as confirmation of guilt. "My father did owe money to Rurik Thorsson," she said carefully. "The circumstances were more complicated than simple guild records indicate, involving guarantees and obligations that existed outside formal documentation. But you discovered that the debt as originally presented was fraudulent." The direct question demanded a direct answer. Elska looked at Rurik, seeing resignation in his expression as he prepared for her to reveal the truth that would condemn him. "I discovered that the situation was more complex than I initially understood," she said. "But I also discovered that my association with Rurik's enterprise has provided opportunities and education that have genuine value. That doesn't answer whether you were coerced into service through fraudulent claims." Elska took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would shape multiple lives. "I was presented with a choice between seeing my family dishonored and accepting terms of service that preserved our reputation while providing a path forward. Whether that choice was based on complete truth or partial deception, I made it freely and have benefited from its consequences." Gunnar studied her face with obvious frustration. "You're protecting a man who destroyed your family for his personal profit. I'm describing a situation that transformed my life from hopeless poverty to meaningful partnership. Whatever mistakes were made in its beginning, the outcome has exceeded any reasonable expectations." Behind the investigator, she could see some of his men exchanging disappointed glances. They had clearly expected her to provide damning testimony that would support their case against Rurik. "Perhaps we should examine the relevant documents," Gunnar said. Turning back to Rurik, "I assume you have the original contract and supporting materials." "Of course," Rurik gestured toward his cabin. "All business records are properly maintained and available for inspection." As they moved below deck to examine the documents, Elska found herself surrounded by curious crew members who seemed surprised by her defense of their captain. "Didn't expect that," Thorvald muttered. "Thought you'd want revenge after discovering the truth about your father's debt. Revenge serves no purpose," she replied. "Understanding and moving forward do." In the cabin, Gunnar and his assistants spread documents across Rurik's chart table while everyone watched in tense silence. The original contract between Magnus and Rurik, the indenture agreement binding Elska to service, correspondence between various ports regarding business arrangements, all of it laid out for systematic examination. "This additional guarantee that you claim justified the expanded debt," Gunnar said, pointing to a specific document. "Can you provide documentation of the original loan that Magnus guaranteed?" "The loan was arranged through private agreement rather than guild oversight," Rurik replied. "The documentation exists, but is held by parties who prefer to maintain discretion regarding their financial arrangements." "How convenient." "And these parties would be wealthy individuals who make loans based on personal relationships rather than formal commercial structures. Their privacy is essential to their continued willingness to provide such services." Gunnar's expression made clear his opinion of such explanations. "So, you're claiming that Magnus Eriksson guaranteed a debt for which you cannot provide verification to parties you cannot identify, under terms you cannot fully document. I'm claiming that not all legitimate business relationships are recorded in guild ledgers, and I'm suggesting that you fabricated additional obligations to justify enslaving this man's daughter." The accusation sparked visible anger in Rurik. "For the first time during the confrontation, Elska's service has been compensated according to our agreement. Her treatment has been respectful, and her opportunities have expanded considerably. That hardly constitutes slavery, because you've been careful to treat your victim well enough to secure her cooperation," Gunnar shot back. "The quality of treatment doesn't change the fraudulent nature of the original coercion." Elska stepped forward before the argument could escalate further. "May I see the original document that my father signed?" Gunnar handed her the parchment and she studied it carefully. The writing was definitely her father's uncertain hand, but something about the document seemed different from what she remembered. "This isn't the contract I saw," she said slowly. "The one Rurik showed us that night had different language, different terms." Both men turned toward her with sharp attention. "Different how?" Gunnar asked. "This document mentions guarantee obligations clearly and specifically. The one I saw that night focused primarily on the direct loan amount and interest calculations." Understanding dawned in Gunnar's expression. "Two different contracts, one real, one fabricated for presentation to the victim's family." Rurik's face had gone pale, and Elska saw him realize that his carefully constructed defense was crumbling. The existence of multiple versions of the same contract would be impossible to explain as anything other than deliberate fraud. "I want to see all versions of this document," Gunnar demanded. "Every draft, every copy, every variation that exists in your records." As Rurik reluctantly began producing additional papers, Elska felt the weight of revelation settling over the cabin like a shroud. Whatever partial truths he had told her, whatever genuine feelings had developed between them, the foundation of their relationship remained built on systematic deception. The man she had been prepared to defend, to partner with, to possibly love, stood revealed as exactly what his accusers claimed: a predator who destroyed families for profit while maintaining the facade of honorable business practices. "I think," she said quietly, That I need to reconsider my previous statements. The silence in the cabin stretched until it became unbearable. Gunnar Eriksson waited with the patience of a predator who knew his prey was cornered, while Rurik stood frozen, his hand still touching the multiple contracts that had just condemned him. Elska felt the weight of everyone's attention as she processed the implications of what she had discovered. "You said you wanted to reconsider your previous statements," Gunnar prompted gently. "What would you like to tell us about the circumstances of your indenture?" Elska looked at the documents spread across the table. Different versions of her father's contract, each telling a slightly different story, each revealing new layers of calculated deception. Among them, almost lost in the shuffle of papers, she spotted something that made her heart stop, a small seal ring bearing her father's mark. The same ring he had worn since his wedding day. "Where did this come from?" she asked, lifting the ring with trembling fingers. Gunnar examined the piece of jewelry with professional interest. "It was found among Rurik's personal effects during our preliminary investigation. We assumed it was part of the payment recovered from your father's estate. This ring never left my father's finger. He was buried wearing it." Elska's voice grew stronger as understanding dawned. "Which means someone removed it from his body after death, or your father didn't die when you were told he did," Gunnar finished grimly. "We've encountered this pattern before. Families told that their relative has died to prevent interference with debt collection activities. The revelation hit Elska like a physical blow. Everything she had been told, everything she had accepted about her father's death and her obligation to honor his memory was potentially another layer of deception. "Magnus Eriksson is alive," she whispered. "According to our investigation, he was alive and asking questions about his daughter's whereabouts as recently as 2 weeks ago," Gunnar replied. "He never stopped looking for you, never accepted that you had willingly entered indenture." The cabin seemed to spin around her. Her father, weak, dying, but alive, had spent months searching for his vanished daughter while she sailed away, believing she was preserving his honor. The grief she had carried, the sense of loss that had shaped her decisions, the memorial she had built in her heart, all of it based on lies. "You told me he was dead," she said to Rurik, her voice deadly quiet. "You let me believe I was an orphan, that I had no family left to consider in my choices." Rurik finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and uncertain. "I thought the reports I received suggested he was unlikely to survive. You thought it would be more convenient if I believed myself alone in the world," Elska interrupted. "No inconvenient family connections to complicate your plans. It wasn't like that. I genuinely believed—" "Stop." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Just stop lying. We have the evidence, we have the truth, and we all know what you've done." She turned to Gunnar, decision crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on still water. "I want to testify against him. I want to provide whatever evidence will ensure he faces the full consequences of his crimes." "Elska, please." Rurik stepped toward her, but stopped when Eric Ironhand moved to block his path. "You destroyed my family for sport," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You stole months of my life based on fabricated obligations. You made me complicit in your crimes by accepting benefits derived from fraud. And worst of all, you made me care for you while knowing that everything between us was built on systematic deception." "My feelings for you are genuine," Rurik said desperately. "Whatever else was false, that was real. Your feelings?" Elska laughed, but the sound held no humor. "How can I trust anything you claim to feel when you've lied about everything else? How do I know your emotions aren't just another manipulation designed to secure my cooperation?" Gunnar cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion above deck, where we have more room and fewer distractions." As they emerged into daylight, Elska was struck by how normal everything appeared. The sun still shone, the wind still filled their sails, the sea still stretched endlessly in all directions. Only the presence of armed guild investigators indicated that her world had just collapsed for the second time in less than a year. "I'll need you to provide detailed testimony about your experiences." Gunnar told her. Dates, locations, conversations, documentation, anything that can help us understand the full scope of his fraudulent activities. I'll tell you everything I know, and I'll arrange for your immediate transportation back to Norway, where you can be reunited with your father. The prospect of seeing Magnus alive should have filled her with joy, but instead she felt only a hollow numbness. How could she face the man whose suffering she had failed to prevent? How could she explain that she had been living as the willing partner of his tormentor? "There's something else," Gunnar continued, lowering his voice. "The investigation has revealed that Rurik's crimes extend far beyond individual cases of debt fraud. He's been operating as part of a larger network that systematically targets vulnerable families throughout the northern settlements. A network. Wealthy individuals who provide capital for fraudulent schemes in exchange for shares of the profits. Corrupt officials who falsify documents and ignore complaints. Ship captains who transport victims to distant markets where they can be sold without local interference." Gunnar's expression was grim. "Your case may be the key to exposing the entire operation." Elska looked back at Rurik, who stood under guard near the ship's mast. His proud bearing had crumbled, leaving him looking older and smaller than she had ever seen him. The man who had commanded her respect and affection revealed as nothing more than a common criminal who had been particularly skilled at maintaining appearances. What will happen to his crew? Those who can prove they were unaware of illegal activities will be released. Those who knowingly participated will face appropriate penalties. She watched Thorvald and the other sailors she had come to respect, wondering how many of them had been innocent victims of Rurik's deception and how many had been willing accomplices. The relationships she had built, the sense of belonging she had found aboard this ship, all of it contaminated by association with systematic criminality. "I want to speak with him," she said suddenly. "Privately, before you take him into custody." Gunnar looked uncertain. "I'm not sure that's advisable. He's proven himself capable of considerable manipulation. I need to understand why. I need to hear him explain how someone capable of genuine kindness could also systematically destroy innocent families." After brief consideration, Gunnar nodded. 5 minutes under supervision. They brought Rurik to the ship's stern, far enough from the crew to allow private conversation, but close enough for the guards to intervene if necessary. Up close, Elska could see the weight of his crimes written in the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had been running from consequences for too long. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because I was angry," he replied after a long pause. "Because losing Magnus and Astrid broke something inside me that I didn't know how to repair. Because destroying other families felt like sharing the pain instead of bearing it alone. And the business justifications, the claims about aggressive but legal practices. Lies I told myself to make the cruelty bearable." Rurik's voice was barely above a whisper. "At first I told myself I was only bending rules, only taking advantage of opportunities that others were too scrupulous to pursue. But each success made the next deception easier until I lost track of where legitimate business ended and criminality began." "When did you realize you had become someone you couldn't recognize?" "The night you offered yourself in place of your father's debt. I saw my own desperation reflected in your eyes, and I understood that I had become the kind of person who destroys hope for profit." He looked directly at her. "That's when I knew. I had to change. Why I offered you partnership terms instead of simple indenture. But you still didn't tell me the truth. Because I was afraid you would leave, and I had begun to need your presence more than I could afford to admit." Elska studied his face, trying to reconcile the man before her with both the cruel manipulator and the caring partner she had known. "What you felt for me, was any of it real?" "All of it. The respect, the admiration, the growing affection. Everything I shared with you was genuine." His voice broke slightly. "Which makes my deception even more unforgivable, because I corrupted something beautiful with my selfishness." "Time's up," Gunnar announced, approaching with restraints. As they bound Rurik's hands and prepared to transfer him to the guild vessel, He turned back to Elska one final time. "I know you have no reason to believe me, but I want you to know that loving you changed me back into someone I could respect, even if it came too late to matter." Elska watched them take him away, feeling a complex mixture of grief, anger, and something disturbingly close to pity. The man who had given her strength and confidence was also the man who had stolen her father's ring from his dying hand. Both versions were real, both were true, and somehow she would have to find a way to live with that contradiction. Magnus's seal ring sat heavy in her palm as the guild ship sailed away with its prisoner. Soon she would return it to the father she had thought was dead, and together they would try to rebuild what remained of their family's honor. But first, she had testimony to give and justice to serve. 6 months later, Elska stood at the helm of her own trading vessel, watching the familiar coastline of Cavernum emerge from the morning mist. The ship beneath her feet was smaller than Rurik's had been, but it was honestly earned, purchased with profits from legitimate trading ventures that she now conducted in partnership with reformed members of his former crew. Thorvald worked the tiller beside her, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as they navigated the treacherous rocks that guarded their home harbor. "Good to be back," he said simply. "Been too long since we've seen these waters." The past half-year had transformed her life yet again, but this time the changes were built on truth rather than deception. After providing testimony that helped convict Rurik and expose the criminal network he had served, she had faced a choice: return to the limited life of a fisherman's daughter, or use the skills and connections she had gained to build something entirely new. She had chosen to build, working with Eric Ironhand and several other crew members who had proven their innocence of Rurik's crimes. She had established a trading enterprise based on the partnership principles she had first articulated in Stavanger. Shared investment, mutual risk, transparent dealing, the model was proving successful enough to attract interest from merchants throughout the northern settlements. "There's your father," Thorvald observed, pointing toward the dock where a familiar figure waited. Magnus Eriksson stood straighter than when she had last seen him, his health restored by proper food and the knowledge that his daughter was safe. The months of searching for her, the grief of believing himself responsible for her disappearance, had aged him considerably. But the man who waved from the pier carried himself with the dignity of someone whose honor had been vindicated. As they tied up to the dock, Elska fingered the new ship's banner that flew from their mast, a design she had woven herself during the long winter months of establishing their business. The fabric bore symbols representing partnership and honest dealing, worked in colors that caught the light and proclaimed their values to anyone who cared to understand. "Welcome home, daughter," Magnus said as she stepped onto the familiar stones of Cavernum's harbor. His embrace was fierce, carrying months of worry and relief. "It's good to be back, father, though I'm not the same person who left here. Nor should you be. Hardship either breaks us or makes us stronger, and you've clearly chosen strength." They walked together toward the hut that had been her childhood home, now expanded and improved with funds from her trading success. Magnus had used her financial support to modernize his fishing equipment and form partnerships with other village families, creating a small but thriving cooperative that served the entire community. "Tell me about the trial," he said as they settled beside the familiar hearth. Justice was served. Rurik received 10 years of hard labor, his assets were seized to compensate victims, and the network he served was dismantled. Elska paused, choosing her words carefully. "He expressed genuine remorse and asked me to convey his apologies to you personally. And how did that make you feel?" The question was perceptive, recognizing the complex emotions she still carried regarding the man who had been both her destroyer and her teacher. Sad, angry, grateful, confused. She looked directly at her father. "I loved him, despite everything he had done. That doesn't excuse his crimes, but it makes the betrayal harder to forget." Magnus nodded thoughtfully. "Love doesn't always choose worthy objects. The heart sees potential that the mind recognizes as illusion. They talked through the afternoon, sharing stories and observations that helped bridge the months of separation. Magnus described his frantic search for his missing daughter, the growing certainty that something terrible had happened, the moment when guild investigators had contacted him with news of her safety. Elska, in turn, recounted her experiences, the legitimate skills she had gained, the confidence she had developed, the business relationships that had survived the scandal of her association with Rurik's crimes. She spoke carefully about the man who had shaped her transformation, neither defending his actions nor denying the genuine growth she had experienced under his guidance. As evening approached, other villagers began arriving to welcome her home and hear news of her adventures. The gatherings had the warm familiarity of her childhood, but she noticed that people now sought her advice on matters of trade and commerce. Her experiences had given her knowledge that could benefit the entire community. The Grimson family in Stavanger is interested in establishing a permanent trading relationship with our fishing cooperative, she announced to the assembled group. They're offering guaranteed purchases of our catch at fixed prices, plus access to their distribution networks throughout the southern settlements. What would they want in return? Asked Eric Olofsson, the village headman. Exclusive rights to our highest quality fish, plus our commitment to provide market information about conditions in the northern ports. Elska smiled. It's exactly the kind of mutually beneficial arrangement that serves everyone's interests. The discussions that followed demonstrated how much both she and her community had grown. Where once they had been isolated by geography and limited perspective, they now understood their connection to larger economic networks. Her journey, however painful in its inception, had created opportunities that benefited everyone. Later that evening, as the village settled into nighttime quiet, Elska walked alone to the harbour wall where she had often sat as a child. The stars reflected in the still water, and she could hear the gentle sound of waves against stone that had provided the soundtrack to her earliest memories. Complicated thoughts? Came a voice behind her. She turned to find Thorvald approaching, carrying 2 cups of ale. Just reflecting on how strange life can be. A year ago, I was a desperate young woman, willing to sacrifice everything for family honor. Now I'm a ship owner with more opportunities than I ever imagined. And how do you feel about the path that brought you here? Elska considered the question carefully. Grateful for where I've arrived, despite regretting much of how I got here. Rurik's crimes were inexcusable, but the strength I developed while working with him has proven valuable. You've built something good from poisoned foundations. Perhaps that's all any of us can do. Take whatever circumstances we're given and try to create something worthy from them. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights of fishing boats returning from their evening work. In the distance, Elska could see her own vessel riding at anchor, its banner catching moonlight like a promise of future ventures. What's next? Thorvald asked eventually. We expand carefully. Establish relationships with reliable partners in new ports. Build a reputation based on honest dealing and mutual benefit, Elska smiled. And we make sure that families like mine never again face the choice between honor and survival. Using the lessons you learned from someone who exploited that exact vulnerability. Using everything I learned from everyone who taught me to build something better than what existed before. As she prepared to return to her father's house, now her house as well, since she had become the family's primary provider, Elska touched the simple iron brooch at her shoulder. Her mother's legacy, representing love that transcended loss, strength that survived hardship, hope that endured despite disappointment. The woman who had died bringing life into the world would have understood her daughter's journey. Love and loss, betrayal and growth, the endless cycle of destruction and renewal that defined human experience. What mattered was not the pain encountered along the way, but the wisdom gained and the good accomplished despite that pain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new choices that would shape her future and that of the community she served. The partnership model she had pioneered was attracting attention from trading families throughout the region. and she sensed that larger changes were coming to the world of northern commerce. But tonight, she was simply Elska Magnusdottir, daughter of Magnus, heir to generations of honest fishermen who had built their lives one day at a time through courage, integrity, and the willingness to face whatever storms life brought their way. The new ship's banner fluttered in the harbor breeze, its symbols catching starlight like promises written in cloth and hope. Partnership, honesty, mutual respect. The values that would guide her future ventures, learned at great cost, but applied with wisdom, earned through experience. She had begun this journey as payment for a fraudulent debt. She was ending it as the architect of her own destiny, carrying lessons that would benefit not just herself, but everyone whose lives she touched. The